Thanks for coming back after lunch. Hope everybody enjoyed their lunch. We are excited for the next agenda item to have a panel consisting of our state agency partners whose department or agency has in one way or another collaborated with us on the report. And if they haven't done much collaborating with us, they will now. So I would like to turn this over to Dave Edwards, OEHHA's Chief Deputy Director. He will be moderating this part of the agenda. Dave.
Great. Thanks, Carmen. Does everyone hear me okay? Great. Thank you. All right. So as Carmen mentioned, I'm here to facilitate this panel discussion for our contributors to the indicator report. Really excited to hear what they have regarding updates associated with the indicators that are already in the report. And so with that, so we are able to have some time for questions at the end. I'm gonna kick it over to Elizabeth Scheehle, who is Chief of the Research Division at the California Air Resources Board. Elizabeth has over 20 years of experience in air quality and climate programs, 15 of which have been at CARB. In her current role, she oversees research, planning, and implementation for the agency, as well as health impact analysis, indoor air quality, and regulations on high global warming potential gases. Before joining CARB, Elizabeth was a senior analyst at US EPA's Climate Change Division, and she served as an expert for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In that role, she earned recognition for her contribution to the IPCC's Nobel Prize. She holds a master's degree of public health from Johns Hopkins, a master's in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and an undergraduate degree in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences from Georgia Institute of Technology. Elizabeth.
Great, thanks, Dave. And I just wanted to give a thank you to OEHHA for organizing and inviting me, and especially to Carmen. I know these things take a lot of work to pull off and gather together, so really appreciate having this opportunity to speak to y'all. And just also seeing people in the room, I was afraid with the rain that there may not be as big a turnout, but it's great to see folks in the room and hopefully a lot of folks online as well. So I was asked to speak about climate change drivers, and I will start out with that. I will talk a little bit as well about CARB's mitigation efforts and some of the areas that we're focusing on and why, kind of how that connects to the drivers and what we're looking to do to those drivers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So next slide. First, we've talked about the IPCC a little bit. It was brought up this morning, so I won't go into detail about what that is. But I will mention that this graphic is from the 2021 report from Working Group 1 of the IPCC. And what it really indicates, or it really reaffirms, is the relationship between anthropogenic CO2 emissions and global warming. We all know this, it's just reaffirmed it with high confidence. It also, kind of going back to what was talked about in the discussion this morning, the 1.5 degree increase. So under all scenarios within this report, we're expected to go over that 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. And looking out forward, the 2% and the 2 degrees increase over pre-industrials, where we really expect to see irreversible climate change impacts. And so we want to make sure we stay under that amount. It really urges us to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 and other emissions as well, because we want to stabilize the human-induced global temperature rise. We expect the global surface temperature to decline once we reach that net zero CO2 emissions. Next slide. So as I said, achieving the net zero CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions is critical. It's going to take time to reduce CO2, and it's really important to consider the short-lived climate pollutants, or SLCPs. They're relatively short-lived in the atmosphere. For example, CO2 has an atmospheric lifetime of 100 years. Methane is about 12 years in the atmosphere. So if you can reduce those, you can actually get a near-term impact. So while we're reducing CO2, you reduce methane in the short term, you can actually see an impact in the nearer term. So you can achieve a quicker global warming slowdown and give us more time to address the global CO2 emissions. And this was reiterated by both the UN Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization as really critical for maintaining global mean temperatures below that 2 degrees Celsius. Some of the SLCPs that I'll talk about are methane and fluorinated gases, and they're actually expected to increase in the coming years. So the bottom line message is we need to decrease and achieve sustained CO2 emissions decreases to prevent irreversible damage, but we also need to address SLCPs in the short term. Next slide. So this shows the current atmospheric levels of all three major greenhouse gas emissions: CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. The HFCs, high global warming potential gases, are not on here, but we'll talk about those a little bit later. So the global mean average CO2 concentration has reached 50% greater than pre-industrial levels. And for methane, the concentration level is 165% increase over pre-industrial levels. The annual atmospheric concentration for NO2 has is at 1.3 parts per billion, a slight increase in emissions compared to prior years. You'll also notice a slight upward trend in the global growth rate of CO2 and methane over the last decade. And this tells us that not only are concentrations increasing globally, but the emissions are also increasing globally. So let's shift a little bit to California with the next slide and what's happening with emissions in California. So the 2021 greenhouse gas emissions were about 380 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, or CO2e, and that's in the most recent greenhouse gas inventory. The transportation sector remained the largest and most important source of greenhouse gas emissions at about 38% of statewide emissions. High GOP emissions have grown in terms of their percentage, and they're now about 6% of the total. We observed significant reductions in the electric power sector since early 2000s, attributable to the deployment of renewables and less carbon-intensive sources. So this now contributes about 16%. Agriculture sector accounted for 8%, mostly from methane and N2O, and emissions from the waste sector is at 2%. I do want to note that the growth in statewide emissions from 2020, you kind of see a little uptick there, notable as you can see in the transportation sector mostly, and that was related obviously to what was happening in the pandemic. So we don't expect that uptick to continue in the same way. So next slide. I'm going to transition a little bit and pivot from drivers to mitigation, how we're addressing some of those drivers that I talked about. I'll start on the Climate Investments Program. So since the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund was founded in 2012, climate change investments have grown significantly from just 12 agencies to over 24 agencies administering over 80 programs today. They cover a wide variety of programs, audiences, project types, ranging from things like community-led projects, community car sharing, composting, rebates for purchase of cleaner vehicles, wood stove replacements, public transport, things like that. It's also implementing a variety of nature-based solutions to sequester carbon and prevent greenhouse gas emissions through strategies like protecting forests from wildfires. The benefits of these projects in priority communities were about $7.2 billion, or approximately 74% of the investments were in priority communities. And we continue to work to foster equitable access to funds through outreach, technical assistance, and capacity building, and by supporting community priorities. Next slide. So I'll cover a few areas where we're focusing on mitigation action areas. One focus area is pretty evident. I think most of us over the last 5 years or so have been exposed to wildfire smoke. I know there was one year where I think at some point the entire state was exposed to wildfire smoke. So I think this is something that is a reality for most of us in the room and probably online as well. And wildfires release CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases, so they also contribute to climate change. And as part of the upcoming, it feels like we just finished the scoping plan, but there's another one we're already starting to work on. And as part of that effort, we will be looking at projecting net flux or changes in carbon and looking at states' natural and working lands, looking at how that carbon sequestration and emissions from wildfires impacts that as well. Next slide. And of course, as the head of a research division, I can't fail to mention some of what we're doing on research. So we actually have quite a few funded studies on wildfires. One I wanted to highlight was a research project to evaluate air quality and health impacts of wildfires and prescribed burns, particularly at urban population centers that are downwind of the fire smoke. And so those results will help us evaluate various actions and interventions that could be employed at the individual and community level to mitigate the public health impact, to look at exposure. We've also used a community-engaged collaborative approach in designing our smoke-ready communities research. So that supports local partners in increasing public health readiness for wildfire smoke. And we continue to research wildfire impacts on air quality, health risks, and identify exposure reduction strategies. So as I mentioned, I will talk about HFCs a little bit more, and this is a little near and dear to my heart because I've worked on this probably since about the beginning of my career 20 or so years ago, and it's not an area that a lot of people tend to focus on, but it is important. They're high global warming potential gases, and they have global warming potentials 100,000 times greater than that of CO2. What they are is actually mainly refrigerants. So in this building, you'll have it in refrigeration systems, in your air conditioning. At your house, you'll have it in your air conditioning system or your refrigerator, things like that. So it's very dispersed across the state. We've taken actually quite a few measures to tackle these emissions. There's a refrigerant management program which tracks and manages emissions from big sources, refrigeration sources. Think a lot of that's your grocery stores, things like that. We also have adopted regulations on consumer products, semiconductor manufacturing, and small cans that you use to refill your auto AC as well. So when we recently are very proud to have launched a $65 million program that provides incentives, and that will have a focus in disadvantaged communities as well. So next slide. The next focus is greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. Trucks are the largest source of air pollution from vehicles statewide, and this costs the community and the economy in the form of asthma, hospitalizations, cancer, and now there's a link with Alzheimer's. And they're a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. 6 states are working towards adopting our heavy-duty regulations, which would more than double the California regulations. And as with our action on light-duty vehicles, these state-level partnerships really remain important to provide market certainty and really align on infrastructure. I'm getting towards the end of the action areas. So just focusing on methane reductions and the methane's really from, most of it's from dairy, livestock, landfills, oil and gas areas. And the map on the right here shows the results of one of our contracts that identified local high emitting methane sources. And you can see that it's really spatially distributed across the state. The ag sector is the largest methane emitting sector in the state, and we have funded methane reducing technologies, and we'll continue to look at other technologies as well. With methane being responsible for up to 25% of the current global warming and a lifetime of only 12 years, reducing its emissions, as I said earlier, will significantly help the pace of climate change and rising temperatures. So that's part of why we're interested in investing in this sector. So I can't finish my presentation without focusing on research as the research director. So looking at how it supports our efforts on climate change. And I wanted to talk about the process that we go about in developing our research and really invite you all to participate in it as well, because we're just starting out on our 5-year plan. And so that engagement process is going to start in the next few months. And that really sets out what are the initiatives, what are our priorities as an agency for research over the next 5 years. And we welcome everybody's input. We're trying to do more outreach on this as well. So this is a great opportunity, and part of the reason I was so thankful for the invitation here to kind of get out the word on what we're doing as well. So that's going to be a starting point for achieving our goals of operationalizing racial equity in our research, and while also addressing air quality and climate change research questions simultaneously. We're going to engage with communities, advocates, and researchers on these issues and to develop and define metrics. So as I said, I encourage all of you to get involved. I also wanted to mention a big effort that the legislature supported in giving us $100 million towards satellites, which we can use to detect methane. So as you can see in the picture here, you can actually see the plume and tell where it comes from. So it provides a good opportunity to be able to highlight a source and be able to go out and find and fix that source pretty quickly. So we are excited about the $100 million that we have for this effort, and being able to, we have a competitive RFP process that's moving forward on that. And finally, collaboration and engagement is super important to what we do and to help solve this problem. Climate change is a big problem. Research to support what we do on climate change, we really need everybody's voice and everybody to partner and collaborate with. We only have a limited budget in which we work, and collaboration and leveraging funds is super important, and understanding the needs from everybody's perspective as well. So we enjoy meetings like this to bring everyone together at the same table to really push towards that common goal. And with that, I will give it back to Dave. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth.